I remember the first time I stumbled upon the endless live stream, late at night when my insomnia had gotten the better of me, and I was mindlessly scrolling through random channels, searching for anything to distract me from the quiet emptiness of my apartment and the disquieting thoughts that always crept in when the world seemed to slumber. It started innocently enough, a suggestion popping up on my feed with a cryptic thumbnail image that looked like some grainy security footage of a long, dimly lit corridor. The title simply reading, "Live 24/7. Don't watch alone," which, in my sleepless haze, felt like a dare I couldn't resist. I told myself it was probably just another experimental stream or perhaps some bizarre art project with a looping pre-recorded feed, but the moment I clicked on it, I sensed an unsettling aura emanating from the flickering screen, a tangible tension that snaked its way through the digital realm and coiled around my gut. Even though the resolution was terrible, I could make out the general shape of a corridor that seemed to stretch on indefinitely, with no visible end in sight, its walls lined with battered doors that looked warped by age or neglect, each door spaced maybe 15 feet apart. Though the lighting was so poor, it was hard to determine any real depth or accurate measurement. I watched for a few minutes, fully expecting some commentary to pop up or a narrator to address the audience, but there was only a constant hush, punctuated by faint static that crackled like distant radio interference, and every so often, the camera view would slowly pan to the left or right, as if someone was manually controlling it, searching for something lurking in the shadows. My curiosity overrode my common sense, and I began to look at the chat box that scrolled alongside the video, noticing that most comments were short exclamations of fear, confusion, or attempts at humor, people goading each other to keep watching or speculating about what lay behind the endless stretch of closed doors, as if they were collectively waiting for something horrifying or miraculous to happen. A few users insisted they had been following this live stream for days, claiming that on rare occasions, the camera would pass by a door and one could hear a quiet tapping from the other side, or see the faint outline of something pressed against the tiny window set in the door's upper panel, but no one had ever gotten a clear view of what it was. My rational mind told me it had to be some elaborate production, maybe a group of filmmakers testing audience engagement through interactive horror elements. Yet a deeper part of me, the part that reveled in the creeping dread and the late-night isolation, felt an unshakable certainty that this stream was more than a simple hoax, that something about its oppressive atmosphere was profoundly real. As the clock neared 3 in the morning, I realized I had been watching for nearly an hour without blinking away, transfixed by the glacial pace of the camera's forward movement along that infinite hallway, wondering if my eyes might catch some fleeting movement in the gloom, a shape darting from one door to another, or a figure stepping into the corridor. Before I knew it, my own chat comment had appeared, as if typed without my conscious permission, saying something like, "Is anyone else getting a sense that the hallway is breathing?" which was quickly lost in the torrent of other messages, yet it lingered in my mind as I stared at the gently shifting shadows that almost seemed to expand and contract in tandem with my ragged breathing. I felt a prickle of unease ripple over my arms when someone in the chat responded directly to me, calling me by my screen handle and claiming that I wasn't imagining it, that the hallway did indeed seem alive, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic movement that grew more pronounced whenever new viewers tuned in, as if feeding on attention. I tried to brush off that notion, but the more I watched, the more I noticed that whenever the chat spiked with fresh arrivals, the camera lens would flicker slightly, and a soft hum would buzz through the speakers, almost imperceptible but unmistakable, like an insect's wings beating frantically against glass. Determined to prove to myself that this was just a well-crafted illusion, I opened a new tab to search for any information on the endless live stream, typing keywords about haunted corridors and 24/7 horror streams, only to find countless forum threads that led me down a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, rumors of watchers who had vanished, and cryptic references to the stream's rumored origins on the dark web. The stories, though varied in detail, shared a recurring theme. Those who became obsessed with a corridor claimed to see it in their dreams, or in reflective surfaces around their homes, whispering that the walls of reality were slowly merging with the world of the live stream, as though the corridor's endless length extended beyond the screen into the watcher's private spaces. Initially, I dismissed such claims as the typical creepypasta fare that thrives on digital folklore, but around 4 in the morning, just as my eyelids grew heavy, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corridor feed, something that darted across the hallway near the far edges of the camera's view, too quick to capture but undeniable enough to make my heart skip a beat. I leaned forward and scrolled back a few seconds, replaying the moment, but the feed refused to rewind, a true live stream with no rewind function, and the chat exploded with frantic messages from others who had witnessed the same fleeting shape, each describing it in slightly different terms: a slithering shadow, a pale figure with too many limbs, or the silhouette of a person crawling on all fours. My pulse thundered in my ears as I typed out a question to the chat, asking if anyone had ever seen the shape approach the camera, but my message drowned in the chaos of speculation, jokes, and unhelpful spam that cascaded up the screen faster than I could read. Eventually, the camera drifted onward, pushing deeper into the corridor, and the shape did not reappear, leaving me with a deep sense of unease that burrowed into my stomach. Despite my better judgment, I couldn't tear myself away from the live stream, feeling as though I'd stumbled upon some forbidden secret, an unspoken challenge to keep watching, to see if I could handle whatever revelation lay at the corridor's far end, or lack thereof. By sunrise, I was still glued to the screen, the chat beginning to slow as many viewers presumably fell asleep or lost interest. Yet I hovered in that twilight state of half-awareness, eyes gritty, mind teetering on the edge of delirium, my fingers drumming nervously on the desk. That was when I heard the knocking, distinct, sharp raps against one of the corridor doors, resonating through my headphones as if someone or something was urgently trying to get out, or perhaps get in, though I had no idea what lay on the other side of those endless battered doors. The chat erupted once more, everyone demanding that the camera pan closer, that we get a better look. But the camera continued its steady, automated path, ignoring our collective pleas, as though the stream's controller had no interest in satisfying our morbid curiosity and was content to let us stew in our unanswered questions. Unable to take it any longer, I typed a frustrated message, then closed the browser tab, deciding that I needed a shred of normalcy, a moment to remind myself that my apartment was not some haunted corridor, and that reality still consisted of sunlight, fresh coffee, and errands to run. Yet even stepping away from the computer did little to chase away the creeping sense of dread, because I found myself glancing down my own hallway with a start, half expecting to see the walls shifting or a door that didn't exist before, my mind playing tricks on me in the aftermath of so many tense, sleepless hours. I told myself it was just an overactive imagination, a result of too little rest and too much time spent staring at ominous shadows. A small part of me whispered that once you let something like that into your thoughts, it was incredibly difficult to force it out. All day, I felt an insidious urge to check the stream again, to see if the corridor had changed or if the figure might have reappeared, as though my curiosity was being weaponized against me by the silent, unending feed. By evening, I caved, pulling up the live stream on my phone, only to find that it was still exactly as I'd left it. The same corridor, the same maddening hush, and a chat full of anxious viewers demanding to know if anyone had deciphered the meaning behind the faint symbols scrawled on the walls. Symbols I discovered that I hadn't noticed before, perhaps because the stream's resolution was so poor, or maybe they had only just appeared, swirling shapes carved or painted onto the corridor's surface in irregular intervals, some resembling eyes, others looking like twisted runes. My stomach lurched as I realized the camera was inching closer to one of those symbols, allowing me to see it more clearly, and a primal part of my mind recoiled from the jagged lines, convinced that they weren't just random graffiti, but rather something akin to a doorway or a series of instructions for opening one. The chat speculation was rampant, with some claiming the symbols belonged to an ancient alphabet used in forbidden rituals, others insisting they were part of a coded message left by the corridor's original inhabitants, if such a concept even made sense, but no one could definitively translate their meaning. I felt compelled to take a screenshot so I could study the symbol later, but as soon as I tried, my phone froze, the screen flickering with static, forcing me to reboot the device, and by the time I returned to the stream, the camera had moved on, leaving me with only the fleeting memory of those jagged marks. After that, I started having nightmares, short bursts of terror that jolted me awake drenched in sweat, images of wandering that corridor alone, hearing my own footsteps echoing against those endless walls, feeling an unshakable certainty that something was just behind me, breathing down my neck, waiting for me to turn around so it could latch onto my face. In these dreams, the doors were no longer closed. They stood half open, revealing glimpses of dark rooms where fleeting shapes crouched or slithered away the moment I tried to focus on them, and a sourceless chanting reverberated through my skull as I walked. Each day, I told myself I would stop watching, that the only way to reclaim my peace of mind was to break free of the endless live stream's insidious pull, yet each evening, I found myself gravitating back to it like a moth to a lethal flame, lured by the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I would witness something that explained the corridor's existence. My friends started noticing my haggard appearance and glassy eyes, asking if I'd picked up a new job or if I was battling insomnia. And though I lied, saying I was just stressed from work, part of me wanted to warn them about the corridor feed, to see if they'd heard any rumors, but I held back, afraid of sounding unhinged. One night, as I was silently lurking in the chat, I noticed a user with a handle corridor walker, calmly explaining that they had once found themselves actually walking in the corridor after too many nights of watching, as if the boundaries between the stream and their physical reality had dissolved, though the rest of the chat mocked them relentlessly. However, the more I read their words, the more I recognized the quiet despair in their tone, Something about their descriptions of the corridor's smell, a damp, musty odor like wet concrete, and the cold that seeped into their bones felt uncannily authentic. When I reached out to them in a private message, they responded cryptically, warning me that if I didn't stop soon, I would also receive the invitation, a singular moment when the corridor would appear tangible in my own surroundings, beckoning me to step inside. My heart pounded at the notion, and I typed a flurry of questions, but they went silent, never responding, their account vanishing from the chat like a ghost retreating into the shadows. From then on, I felt a constant sense of being watched whenever I tried to sleep, as though the corridor's camera had turned its gaze outward, scanning not just the hallway but my own room, observing me through unseen eyes. I began hearing muffled sounds at odd hours, knocks and distant murmurs that I couldn't locate, and once or twice, I could have sworn I glimpsed the corner of my bedroom wall distorting, as if forming into a shadowy rectangle reminiscent of a door. Determined not to lose my sanity, I confided in my best friend, half expecting them to laugh, but they listened with genuine concern, promising to watch a few minutes of the stream to see what the fuss was about, despite my protest that it might pull them into the same obsession. To my relief, they claimed it was just a weird art project, feeling no fascination or dread, quickly losing interest and telling me to lighten up, as if the corridor's power only worked on certain individuals with susceptible minds. That same night, I woke around 3 in the morning to a dreamlike state, my vision swimming, and saw that my computer screen was on, the browser set to the live stream, though I remembered shutting everything down before bed. My entire body felt leaden, but I managed to shuffle over, intending to turn it off, only to find the corridor feed had changed. The camera was no longer roving aimlessly, but fixed on a single door that was ever so slightly open, warm light seeping out from within, as though welcoming me inside. The chat was empty. No participants, no messages, just a blank void beneath the video, as though I was the only one allowed to witness this moment, and I stare at that partially open door, fighting the impulse to step closer to the screen, feeling an unexplainable magnetism that made my heart hammer in my chest. A single whisper emanated from my speakers, so faint I could barely catch the words, but it sounded like my name being repeated, a gentle, coaxing voice that reminded me of a lullaby, compelling me to lean in further. My reflection in the dark computer screen was overshadowed by the corridor's flickering light, and for a heartbeat, I swore my reflection's eyes were not my own, that something else stared back at me from behind the glass, a hungry gleam in its pupils. Then the feed cut out, replaced by a plain black screen, and I nearly collapsed, trembling from the adrenaline, the hush of my apartment feeling oppressive and unsafe, as though a presence lingered in every corner, waiting to see how I would react. I spent the rest of that night pacing, too afraid to lie down, convinced that if I drifted off, the corridor would manifest physically in my room and drag me into its haunted depths. The next morning, after calling in sick to work, I scoured the internet for any trace of the corridor's location, desperate to determine if it was a real place I could investigate or an elaborate digital hoax. But everything I found only fueled my dread. Countless testimonies of watchers who had glimpsed impossible phenomena, stories of vanishing people, conspiracy theories linking the corridor to secret government experiments, or arcane cult rituals. My resolve to break away faltered, replaced by a grim acceptance that I was too deep to simply walk off, that the corridor had sunk its hooks into my psyche, weaving nightmares and illusions around me with malicious precision. I decided to consult an old friend of mine who dabbled in paranormal research, a self-proclaimed occult scholar who had once helped me parse through strange experiences I'd had as a child, but I hadn't contacted them in years. When I finally reached them by phone, they listened intently as I described the endless live stream, the corridor, and the shape or presence that lurked within, telling me in a measured tone that it sounded like a tulpa of digital origin, a manifestation of collective fear and obsession that had taken on a life of its own in cyberspace. According to my friend, every viewer who fixated on the corridor contributed to its power, fueling its existence until it could breach the confines of the screen and affect reality in small but terrifying ways. They suggested I cut myself off from the stream entirely, purging my devices and blocking any mention of it, but I felt a gut-level certainty that it was too late for such simple measures, that the corridor was already embedded in my subconscious, poised to become a gateway if I failed to confront it directly. Desperation led me to propose a bold plan. If the corridor wanted me, perhaps I could force a confrontation on my own terms by diving deeper into the stream, broadcasting my intention to break the chain of watchers who fed it. My friend warned me this was reckless, that if the corridor was indeed feeding on fear and curiosity, stepping in willingly would be like offering myself up, but I couldn't see another way out. That very night, I set up my own live stream, calling it Corridor Confrontation, and went live on a small channel with few subscribers, explaining that I was about to watch the endless hallway stream with the intention of banishing whatever lurked there. My voice shook as I recounted my experiences, half expecting no one to tune in, but to my surprise, a handful of viewers joined, some out of morbid curiosity, others claiming to be fellow survivors of the corridor's influence, seeking closure or a final resolution. With a deep breath, I pulled up the corridor's feed on a second screen, letting my own audience see it as well, a surreal moment where two streams merged into one digital stage. And for the first time, I noticed the corridor's camera angle had shifted to focus directly on a single door at the far end, as though anticipating my arrival. The hush in my apartment grew tangible, pressing against my eardrums, and electric tension crackled through my fingertips as I reached for the mouse to zoom in on that door. My viewers silent in the chat, all of us collectively holding our breath. The corridor door creaked open on the stream, revealing a swirling darkness that seemed to reach outward, as though the boundaries of the screen were no longer enough to contain whatever dwelled within, and I felt a sudden drop in temperature around me, goosebumps rippling across my skin. In that final moment of clarity, I realized what I had to do. I recited my friend's instructions, the fragment of an old protective rite, speaking words meant to sever the tulpa's hold by refusing the fear it thrived upon, denying it the attention it demanded, even as it encroached on my reality. Yet as I chanted, the corridor's camera view flickered, the darkness pulsed, and I saw faint shapes writhing inside that open doorway, whispers of half-formed limbs and wide, soulless eyes peering back at me, a testament to how many watchers had poured their anxieties into this digital pit, giving it monstrous life. My voice broke, trembling with terror, but I kept going, my viewers in the chat echoing words of encouragement, telling me not to stop, to believe in the severance of the corridor's power, even as I felt the edges of my vision darken, as if I were on the verge of blacking out. Then, in a heart-stopping instant, the corridor's feed cut out, replaced by a sudden burst of static, and my own live stream froze, the chat suspended mid-sentence. A shrill sound blared from my speakers, almost reminiscent of a distant scream, forcing me to yank my headphones off in a panic, and for a terrible moment, I thought the corridor had succeeded in crossing over, that I would turn around to see those doors manifested in my own hallway. But the static subsided, and the screen went dark, leaving me with a reflection of my own pallid face in the black monitor, the only sound the staccato thud of my heart and the ragged hiss of my breath. I blinked, waiting for the corridor to reappear, or for some impossible door to open behind me, but nothing happened, and slowly, my senses returned to normal, the temperature rising back to its usual warmth. On a whim, I tried refreshing the webpage for the endless live stream, but a 404 error popped up, telling me the link was no longer valid, as though the entire feed had been erased from existence in that final surge of static. My phone buzzed with messages from a few of my viewers who had managed to reconnect, congratulating me, though none of us were entirely certain what had transpired or if the corridor was truly gone. Exhaustion crashed over me then, my body and mind shutting down after the prolonged adrenaline rush, and I slumped onto my bed, drifting into a sleep that was both dreamless and oppressively heavy. When morning came, I felt as though days had passed, the memory of the corridor feed already fading like a nightmare that loses its sharp edges in the light of day. Yet the lingering question remained, had I truly sealed that cursed stream, or had I merely forced it into deeper hiding, waiting for its next opportunity to surface? My devices showed no trace of the corridor, the countless forum threads referencing it all returned broken links or error messages, and even the people who claimed they'd watched it for weeks seemed to vanish into the digital haze, leaving me with only the faint recollection of their frantic chat messages. Though part of me felt a triumphant sense of relief, another part recognized that the corridor's nature was to stretch on forever, a cosmic horror that might be beyond the scope of simple exorcisms, and I could not fully shake the suspicion that somewhere out there, in the uncharted recesses of the internet, the corridor continued to exist, waiting for the next curious soul to click, to watch, and to give it life once more. In the days that followed, I kept expecting nightmares to resume, but my sleep was blessedly quiet, and the oppressive feeling in my apartment lifted, replaced by a subtle emptiness akin to the hush after a storm. From time to time, I would search for any mention of the endless live stream on obscure websites or in horror communities, but all references had dried up, as if the entire phenomenon had been scrubbed from collective memory or retroactively removed by some unseen force. A solitary post on a defunct message board caught my eye once, written months before, warning unsuspecting browsers that the corridor was a living entity that needed watchers to sustain itself, urging people to resist the urge to feed it by tuning in. That post ended with a cryptic line that made my skin crawl. When no one watches, it roams the dark, seeking a crack in the screen of your mind. Be vigilant, for ignorance might be your only defense. I printed out that line and taped it above my computer as a reminder of the fragile barrier between normalcy and the horrors that can lurk in the fringes of our digital age, a personal talisman against backsliding into the shadows. Occasionally, I still think about that fleeting shape I saw in the corridor, the one that scuttled across the edge of the camera's view, and wonder if it was a final reflection of my own fear, or if it was something else entirely, a piece of the corridor that broke off and found a way to exist in our reality, silently haunting the corners of my vision whenever I feel watched. Whatever the case, I have learned to limit my late-night internet wanderings, to close certain doors before they open, and to remember that while curiosity is a powerful force, it is not always worth the price if it invites an endless darkness into your waking life. And so, as I conclude this recollection, I cannot definitively say whether the corridor is gone forever or merely biding its time, but I can say that I came away from the experience with a bruised soul and a stern warning that I offer freely to anyone who stumbles across a strange, flickering feed at an ungodly hour. Some doors lead to hallways that stretch beyond reason, feeding on your attention, your nightmares, and your willingness to be enthralled by the unknown. If you value your peace, you might do well to resist that first click, to keep scrolling past anything that whispers, live 24/7. Don't watch alone, for the endless live stream is more than a curiosity. It is a threshold, and once you cross it, you may find that it is all too eager to cross back into you. I spent the next week after the corridor feed vanished in a tense state of half relief and half trepidation, watching my reflection in every reflective surface, double-checking shadows in every corner, and meticulously scanning the internet for any new sign that the endless live stream might have re-emerged under a different link or disguised channel, all while battling an unshakable feeling that the hush in my apartment was merely the quiet eye of a storm still gathering strength behind the scenes, waiting for the perfect moment to show itself once again. In those strange, silent days, I found myself drifting into a pattern of sleepless nights and restless mornings, haunted by the memory of that flickering corridor feed that had nearly swallowed my sanity whole. And though I tried to dismiss the entire ordeal as a bizarre fever dream, I could not forget the jarring final image of that half-open door and the writhing shapes that seemed to beckon me from the threshold. Nor could I discard the sense that something intangible had latched onto my psyche with tenacious intent. At first, I busied myself with mundane tasks, cleaning out drawers, rearranging the furniture, and scrolling through social media on my phone, hoping that immersing myself in trivial routine might dull the edges of the fear that clung to my thoughts. But each time I glimpsed my laptop on the kitchen table, I felt a prickling tension that warned me not to open it without a plan, lest I accidentally stumble across that corridor once more or discover a new iteration of the endless live stream waiting in the shadows of the internet. Determined to reclaim my sense of normalcy, I tried to socialize with friends, venturing out to coffee shops or small gatherings in an attempt to ground myself in the ordinary patterns of everyday life. Yet I found my conversations stilted by an undercurrent of paranoia, a constant awareness that something was watching from beyond the periphery of my vision, and the moment I was alone, my composure would crumble, leaving me trapped in spirals of anxious speculation about whether the corridor truly was gone or merely biding its time. In an effort to wrestle with my own demons and find some measure of closure, I contacted the same friend who had once guided me through that protective rite, describing in detail the unsettling calm that pervaded my apartment and the lingering nightmares that hinted the corridor might have left some psychic residue behind. And though they sympathized, they admitted that their knowledge was limited, cautioning me that sometimes phenomena of this nature do not simply disappear, but instead mutate, adapting to new channels or forging fresh connections with unsuspecting hosts. Restlessness gnawed at me, so one late afternoon, I dug through the dusty corners of the internet once more, scouring obscure forums where people share encounters with the supernatural or the unexplained, hoping to find a clue that might confirm my suspicion that the corridor had simply relocated to some hidden node, a place where only the most determined or reckless could find it. In each cryptic anecdote or half-baked conspiracy theory I came across stirred a dormant fear in my chest, making me question whether I was inching closer to answers or simply plunging deeper into a bottomless pit of paranoia. As the sun set, I stumbled upon a thread titled New Live Horror Stream, Purgatory Hall on a forgotten message board, replete with archived screenshots that showed a hallway similar to the one I knew too well, yet with subtle differences in architecture, such as elongated archways instead of battered doors. And though it was not a perfect match, I felt my pulse quicken, suspecting that the corridor's essence might have re-emerged under a slightly altered guise, testing to see if it could lure in fresh viewers while still ensnaring those who recognized its signature dread. I clicked on the link with trembling fingers, ignoring the internal voice screaming at me to close the page, to preserve what was left of my fragile peace. but perverse curiosity overrode caution as the new live stream loaded, revealing a flickering view of an impossibly long hall with slender pillars and tarnished candelabras lining the walls, each candelabra bearing half-melted candles that dripped wax onto the cracked marble floor, creating a tableau that felt eerily akin to a Gothic dreamscape suspended in some timeless void. A hushed unease pressed against my eardrums as the stream's audio hissed quietly, a low static occasionally broken by faint echoes that could have been distant footsteps or the labored breathing of an unseen presence. And though the camera angle remained static, unlike the corridor feed's meandering perspective, I sensed a restless energy roiling beneath the calm surface, as if the hall itself was waiting for me to dare to keep watching long enough that it might reveal a terrible secret. Despite the unwavering dread curling in my gut, I scanned the chat to see if others shared my suspicion that this purgatory hall was a spiritual successor or twisted sibling of the corridor, and sure enough, a few messages referenced the old endless hallway, asking if anyone else felt that same claustrophobic tension or recognized the subtle way the corners of the screen seemed to pulse, but most participants were newcomers, drawn to the novelty of a never-ending horror stream that promised to deliver an immersive haunted experience. I typed a hesitant greeting, using a pseudonymous username this time, not wanting to attract the corridor's direct attention as I had before, and I asked if anyone had noticed the candelabras flickering in sync with the chat's activity, a phenomenon that reminded me of how the corridor seemed to feed on viewer engagement. But my question quickly disappeared in the flood of messages from thrill-seekers who found the stream amusing rather than unsettling, spamming jokes or demanding jump scares to punctuate their boredom. Determined not to lose track of my own observation, I fixated on the candelabras, noticing that each time the viewer count spiked or the chat surged with new comments, the flames in the background would shimmer with renewed intensity, casting dancing shadows on a marble floor that looked suspiciously like elongated hands or creeping silhouettes. And in that moment, I felt an ice-cold certainty that this was indeed the corridor's new mask, a metamorphosed version of the same predatory entity that once plagued my life. My heart pounded as I debated whether to close the tab and preserve my fragile sense of security or continue watching in hopes of gathering conclusive proof that the corridor's presence had simply relocated, and in the end, my drive to expose its metamorphosis won out, compelling me to remain, jaw clenched, as the camera view slowly began to zoom in on a far archway, revealing a section of the hall shrouded in deeper darkness. As the archway filled the screen, I caught sight of something lurking just beyond its threshold, a twisting, coiling shadow that seemed to breathe, as if it were made of living smoke. And though it was impossible to discern a definite shape, I felt an undeniable familiarity in its pulsing movements, reminiscent of the fleeting figure I once saw slither across the corridor's feed. And a wave of nausea washed over me as I realized I was once again risking direct contact with the same malignant force. Determined not to be a passive victim, I quickly started recording my screen with third-party software, hoping that if the stream vanished again as it had before, I would at least possess some evidence of its existence, something tangible to analyze or show others as proof that I was not simply chasing ghosts of my own paranoia. But I felt my blood run cold when the recording software froze, refusing to capture any footage, as though the stream carried a protective aura that repelled my attempts to document it. The chat, oblivious to my struggles, continued scrolling with a mixture of curiosity and bravado, some users egging on the shadow to come closer, others joking that the streamer needed to up the production value for a better scare. Yet a handful of messages stood out, posted by accounts with minimal activity, warning that she is aware and urging the viewers to leave immediately, reminiscent of the cryptic warnings I once encountered from that corridor walker user who vanished without a trace. At the mention of she, my mind whirled, conjuring images of an entity or caretaker that might reside within these haunted spaces, whether it was the caretaker of the corridor or some newly arisen matriarch of this purgatory hall, a being who thrived on attention and fear, weaving illusions through digital feeds to ensnare watchers across the globe. And I found myself remembering the faint whisper that had called my name during that final confrontation, wondering if this presence was that same voice returned, stronger and more cunning. Suddenly, a shriek of static tore through my speakers, making me jump, and the camera feed blurred momentarily, revealing the shimmering, inky shape at the archway lurching forward, as if crossing the threshold into the main corridor. And the candelabras flared so brightly that the entire hall was momentarily awash in blinding orange light, casting elongated, dancing shadows across the pillars in a frantic display that made the chat explode with excitement and dread in equal measure. I realized in that moment of abject horror that the stream's transformations were synchronous with the watcher's emotional state, much like how the corridor once seemed to breathe with the audience's collective fear, and now this new hall was responding to the heightened tension, flaunting its ability to morph and intensify at will, feeding on the swirling energies of our disturbed fascination and turning them into a living spectacle of dread. A deep hum reverberated through my headphones, rattling my teeth and stirring an almost subliminal vibration in my chest. And though the camera remained fixed on the hall, I felt an acute sensation that something was behind me, leaning in close, as if the boundaries between my reality and the broadcast had thinned to a dangerous degree, allowing that ephemeral presence to press against the veil, leaving me torn between staying to confront it or fleeing in a blind panic. Desperate for a moment of clarity, I tore my gaze away from the screen and forced myself to look around my apartment, only to notice that the lights seemed dimmer than before, the corners draped in unusual darkness, and I could have sworn I saw flickers of candlelit reflections dancing across the walls, like faint impressions of the hall's candelabras superimposed onto my living space, suggesting that my persistent fear was once again allowing the entity to project its domain onto mine. I tried to call out to my friend, the occult researcher, hoping they might guide me through a cleansing ritual or at least offer words of reassurance, but my phone screen remained stubbornly unresponsive, the signal dead, as though a bubble of interference had settled around me, and the unnerving sense that I was locked in place by the hall's watchful presence made my breath turn shallow and my thoughts scramble for any feasible plan of escape. Summoning the last vestiges of courage, I turned back to the computer, my heart pounding, and typed frantically into the chat, warning everyone that this was no mere show, that something alive and malevolent lurked within the stream, urging them to disconnect before it tightened its hold. But my warnings were met with mocking replies and chaotic spam, the majority of viewers seemingly enthralled by the spectacle, craving more darkness rather than heeding caution. Then, in a sudden shift, the camera began to pan slowly, revealing more of the hall's length, row upon row of pillars receding into the gloom, each flanked by doorways reminiscent of mausoleum arches, and above each door was a symbol, faintly glowing in a color that defied easy description, hovering somewhere between violet and charcoal, but so subdued it was easy to miss unless one stared intently, an effect that chilled me to the core, recalling the runes once scrawled on the corridors. As the camera crept further, the chat erupted with speculation, theories about ancient languages, demonic alphabets, or futuristic code, but none of these stray guesses offered any tangible comfort, and I found myself leaning in, my stomach nodding as I glimpsed one particular arch with a symbol that looked uncannily like a stylized eye half-lidded, its lines swirling inward as though to suggest an eternal vigil that recognized me personally, an impression that made my skin prickle with primal alarm. With trembling hands, I attempted to capture a screenshot of that arch, determined not to let the evidence slip away again. But once more my computer froze at the instant I pressed the capture keys, forcing me to watch helplessly as the camera proceeded onward, leaving me with only the ephemeral memory of that ominous eye etched into my mind, a brand of uneasy fascination that pulsed every time I closed my eyes. Struggling to regain control over my own environment, I grabbed a notepad and pen, sketching the eye symbol from memory, but my hands shook so badly that the lines came out jagged, and to my dismay, as soon as I finished the rough outline, a faint static noise coursed through my room, raising the hairs on my arms, as though even attempting to replicate the hall's markings in the physical world had invoked a fraction of its power. I stared at my clumsy sketch, a swirl of fear and determination roiling in my gut, realizing that if the corridor truly had evolved into this new purgatory hall, then perhaps dissecting these runic symbols might be the key to understanding its vulnerabilities. And while it terrified me to think of actively engaging with an eldritch entity, passivity had only led me back into its jaws once before. So I clenched my jaw and resolved to proceed, determined to unravel the puzzle before it devoured me whole. Returning my focus to the live stream, I found the view had changed again, zooming in on the arch at the far end of the hall, which stood partially open like a gaping mouth, exhaling an invisible gloom that pressed against the camera lens, blurring the edges of the feed in a haze of swirling distortion, and the chat erupted with exclamations that something was emerging, though the resolution was too poor to make out more than a ripple of darkness that stretched across the marble floor like an elongated shadow. In the midst of the chat's frantic speculation, my screen abruptly flickered, the entire feed going black for a heartbeat before returning to show a new perspective, as though the camera had leapt deeper into the arch in a single, disorienting jump cut, now revealing a smaller chamber beyond the hall, lit only by a single overhead lamp that swayed gently, as if rocked by an unseen hand, and in the center of this chamber stood an ancient wooden table, bearing an unrecognizable apparatus of gears and levers. I felt an immediate visceral revulsion at the sight of that contraption, though I couldn't articulate why. Perhaps because the geometry of it seemed wrong, the gears locked in improbable angles, or because it resembled a ceremonial device, a puzzle box designed to channel energy from the watchers themselves, and the chat exploded with talk of puzzle streams, escape room aesthetics, and daredevils urging someone to go turn the levers, as if expecting a live participant to appear and engage with the apparatus. Yet I sensed no human presence in the feed, only the haunting emptiness of a place that existed outside ordinary reality, shaped by the intangible cravings of a malignant intelligence. And as the camera zoomed closer, I could almost imagine hearing distant whispering, as though voices emanated from the cracks in the device, pleading in a guttural tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, confirming the worst suspicion that the watchers' collective fear was fueling something monstrous within those gears. I typed furiously in the chat again, imploring anyone listening to realize that we were not simply spectators but unwitting participants in an occult process. Their attention might be driving the device's function, and that if it completed its cycle, we risked unleashing a deeper darkness that would not be confined to any single stream. But my words were lost in the swirl of cynicism, taunts, and memes posted by thrill seekers who found it all delightfully chilling yet refused to believe in any real danger. For a moment, the camera panned around the apparatus, revealing the floor at its base, inscribed with a circular motif of interlocking runes that pulsed faintly with the same indescribable hue I had seen over the arches, and I realized this circle likely acted as the epicenter of the hall's malignant power, the focal point from which it extended its influence out into the digital realm, linking watchers' emotions to whatever malevolent force had taken root in this twisted dimension. A wave of dizziness crashed over me, forcing me to blink repeatedly as I felt the edges of my vision darken, and in that vulnerable state, I caught the faint reflection of my own face in the dark patches of the feed, twisted with panic. But behind me, or perhaps over my shoulder, I glimpsed a shape that did not belong in my apartment, a fleeting suggestion of contorted limbs that mirrored the shadow from the corridor, as if the boundary between screen and reality was dissolving faster than before. I let out a strangled cry, fighting against the cloying dread that urged me to shut off the computer entirely. Yet I stayed my hand, driven by the knowledge that if I severed the connection without finding a way to disrupt the hall's tether, it might only intensify the phenomenon, prompting it to replicate or migrate anew. And so I forced myself to remain, nails digging into my palms, determined to push back with everything I had learned from the corridor's downfall. In desperation, I yanked my notepad off the desk and, referencing the fragment of protective chant my friend had provided during the corridor crisis, began to rewrite it with an emphasis on these new runes, hoping that by merging the warding words with the symbolic geometry I'd glimpsed, I could craft a makeshift banishment, if not to destroy this ephemeral domain, then at least to sever its creeping connection to my living space. The chat scrolled frantically with glitchy messages now, some viewers claiming they saw eyes peering from behind their own monitors, others swearing they felt cold hands on their shoulders, and a few pleading for someone with knowledge of the occult to intervene, galvanizing me with the urgent reminder that I was not the only one in danger. Countless unsuspecting watchers worldwide might also be pulled into this vortex of evil if we failed to act. Raising my voice in a shaky, half-whispered incantation, I read out the warding script I had composed, my breath hitching as I overlaid each rune in my mind with the ones carved on the hall's pillars, projecting an intense mental image of those lines dissolving under the force of the chant. And though I felt foolish and terrified, I could not deny the electricity coursing through my veins, a raw conviction that sometimes the simplest refusal to submit can fray the threads of even the most pervasive dread. Suddenly, the apparatus in the stream emitted a piercing shriek, the gears visibly jamming as sparks of unnatural light erupted around them, and the overhead lamp swung wildly, casting erratic beams across the cracked marble, while the chat erupted in chaos, half the messages devolving into garbled symbols or pleas for help, and then, just like before, the feed imploded into static with a deafening electronic roar, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of my apartment, heart pounding and pen still in hand, uncertain whether I had struck a decisive blow against the hall's power or merely wounded it enough to drive it underground, setting the stage for an even more harrowing confrontation yet to come. I remember how, in the wake of that second confrontation with what I had come to call Purgatory Hall, I spent hours trembling in my apartment, half convinced I had only driven the malignant force deeper into the internet's hidden recesses, and half praying that my desperate incantation had actually severed its influence once and for all. Yet as the days wore on, I came to realize that my small victory, if it could even be called that, was far from absolute, because odd occurrences began to pepper my daily life, subtle at first, a sudden flicker in my peripheral vision while using my phone, an unexpected hiss of static issuing from my speakers when I wasn't even playing audio, but gradually escalating, until it felt as though my entire digital environment was rigged with tripwires ready to drag me back into that haunted dimension if I let my guard slip. I would catch phantom reflections of the hall's arches in my laptop screen when it was idle, as if a ghostly afterimage lingered in the pixels, or sometimes I'd hear faint echoes of that clattering apparatus in the background whenever I joined a video call, prompting me to lie to my friends and coworkers about poor connections or system glitches, too afraid to admit that I suspected the hall was still trying to breach the boundary between my reality and its own twisted domain. Each night, I found my sleep growing fitful again, plagued by half-formed nightmares in which I walked through an abandoned mansion riddled with pillars and candelabras, hearing the clank of gears somewhere in the distance, always out of sight but never far from my mind. And though I tried reciting the protective chant my occult-savvy friend had provided, the words felt thin and insubstantial in those dreams, vanishing like breath in the cold air. My anxiety crested one afternoon when I noticed an online newspaper article describing how a group of curious thrill-seekers on a forum had embarked on a quest to find a real-world location of that creepy marble hallway everyone's talking about, leading me to realize that more people were becoming aware of the phenomenon, drawn like moths to a flame by the promise of a new kind of interactive horror, never suspecting the potential danger that lurked beneath its digital facade. Fearful that the hall was replicating the same pattern of mass fascination as the corridor before it, I reached out to the friend who had once walked me through banishing the corridor's presence, explaining in excruciating detail how I believed the entity had evolved, adopting a new form fueled by watchers' curiosity. But though they listened patiently, they confessed that their knowledge was limited to smaller-scale hauntings and that the shape-shifting digital demon was pushing the boundaries of anything they had researched before. Determined not to let the situation spiral, I conducted my own investigation into the group of forum users who claimed they were searching for the Purgatory Hall, discovering a discussion thread replete with excited speculation. Some members insisted the hall was rumored to occupy a derelict building on the outskirts of an old European city. Others claimed it was a massive studio set in Los Angeles. Still others believed it existed outside normal geography altogether, accessible only via certain IP addresses or coordinates hidden in the dark web. And though most of the theories were laughably conflicting, it was clear that this new obsession was spreading like wildfire. With a sinking heart, I realized that exactly the same mania had once surrounded the corridor, fueling countless rumors of its location and filming methods, until enough watchers had invested their fear and fascination to give the corridor a foothold in their lives, enabling it to manifest in terrifying ways. Now Purgatory Hall was following the same pattern, luring a fresh wave of curious souls with its cryptic architecture and promise of supernatural drama. Each night, I would peruse that forum, my nerves stretched taut, watching as more users posted about glimpses of shadows behind their monitors or hearing unknown footsteps in their homes after midnight. And while many dismissed these as group hysteria or pranks, I recognized the creeping signature of the hall's influence, the slow infiltration that preceded a more violent or spectacular outbreak of otherworldly activity. Because I had lived it once before, and I dreaded the possibility that it might escalate into something unstoppable if left unchecked. In an attempt to guide these unsuspecting watchers away from the precipice, I created an anonymous account and started posting warnings, referencing my experiences with the corridor and cautioning them not to treat the hall as a mere novelty or game. But for the most part, my words fell on deaf ears, as the thirst for adrenaline and novelty overshadowed any cautionary advice. And I could almost sense the presence behind the hall feeding on every fresh comment, every wide-eyed viewer who logged on hoping to see a ghost in real time. 2 weeks passed in this uneasy stalemate, the hall occasionally resurfacing under different stream URLs that vanished just as quickly, leaving behind a handful of screenshots and frantic chat logs, and each time, the shape or presence in the arch seemed slightly different. Sometimes it appeared as a mass of writhing shadow, other times as a tall, feminine figure with a veiled face, standing impossibly still at the far end of the camera's vantage point, as if beckoning watchers to dare approach. The strain on my psyche mounted, and I found myself haunted by a gnawing sense of responsibility. After all, hadn't I, in my final confrontation with the corridor, inadvertently scattered its pieces across the digital realm, allowing it to reform in a mutated shape, or at least failing to ensure its total destruction? My conscience weighed heavily with the possibility that my partial victory had only bought me time, leaving countless others vulnerable. Eventually, my nightmares intensified, culminating in a particularly vivid terror where I found myself standing in a dark void, pillars rising from the emptiness, candelabras dripping hot wax onto my skin, while an immense mechanical apparatus groaned and clanked in the distance, each gear the size of a car tire, turning in slow, methodical rhythms that reverberated through the hollow space of my chest. In that dream, I could sense thousands of watchers behind me, their eyes glued to the back of my head, as if I had become the unwilling protagonist of a new endless live stream, my every fear fueling the machine at the center of the hall, and the realization that their collective gaze pinned me in place sent me into a frenzy, clawing at the darkness for any means of escape. Upon waking, drenched in sweat and gasping for air, I vowed that I would not let myself become a spectacle for the hall's monstrous hunger. I would find a way to confront it on my terms, a direct approach that might sever its growing power before it could anchor itself irrevocably in the minds and devices of thousands. But I also knew that simply replicating the chant or the wards I had used against the corridor might not suffice. This was no longer the same phenomena I had battled once upon a time. It had adapted, learned, and grown sharper. Fueled by desperation, I delved deeper into online arcane texts, searching for references to hauntings that thrived on large audiences, scanning everything from esoteric treatises about egregores, formed by collective belief, to modern-day conspiracy tangents about thought forms weaponized by hidden organizations, until at last, I stumbled upon an ancient grimoire transcription, posted on a questionable site, describing a ritual known as the shattering of the mirror, purportedly used to disperse an entity that had been conjured or shaped by the mental energies of many individuals. The text was half corrupted by scanning errors, peppered with archaic language, but its core premise stood out to me like a beacon. If a presence existed primarily because of a shared, obsessive attention, like a reflection in many minds, then by turning those minds away from it at a critical moment, one might sever its foundation, effectively shattering the mirror in which the entity gazed upon itself. My rational side balked at the notion of orchestrating a mass ritual among random internet users, but I suspected that might be the only way to dismantle Purgatory Hall's power. If it truly feasted on watchers' collective fascination, then we needed to starve it of that attention in a decisive, simultaneous act, forcing the entity to collapse back into the void from which it had emerged. Tentatively, I formulated a plan that sounded borderline impossible. I would reveal myself as the survivor of the corridor fiasco on the same forum where the new watchers were congregating, present my evidence and experiences, and rally them to take part in a coordinated event at a specific time, essentially a synchronized mass sign-off, during which we would all sever our connections to the hall's feeds, shut down our devices, or direct our collective thoughts elsewhere, aiming to deliver a lethal blow to its base of power. In theory, if enough watchers complied in earnest, the entity would be deprived of its life force mid-performance, left with no audience to feed upon, and hopefully disintegrate for good. But in reality, I doubted whether the adrenaline-hungry crowd would willingly give up their midnight spectacle, especially if they hadn't experienced the level of personal terror I had. Still, I had to try, so I spent days drafting a detailed post, recounting everything from the corridor's endless hallway to the shift into Purgatory Hall, weaving in screenshots that had miraculously survived, linking logs from the few times I documented the runes, and describing how the presence behind both phenomena seemed to adapt and escalate with each wave of new watchers, culminating in that monstrous apparatus feed. My heart raced as I clicked the post button, unleashing my confession onto the forum, uncertain if it would be ridiculed, ignored, or perhaps attract the entity's wrath, but I felt that small spark of rebellious hope that maybe, just maybe, I could break the cycle if enough people believed me. Predictably, the initial responses ranged from mockery, users accusing me of fear-mongering or trying to steal the spotlight for some elaborate roleplay, to cautious curiosity from a handful of seasoned veterans who recalled the corridor from months prior, and among them, a few recognized my descriptions, verifying that they had encountered the corridor and lost track of it after the final meltdown I'd streamed. One user in particular, going by the handle Liminal Truther, expressed an almost religious fervor upon reading my post, claiming they'd been haunted by partial visions of a hallway for weeks, including pillars and candelabras, and that they needed a solution desperately because it was seeping into their everyday life with poltergeist-like manifestations. Sensing an ally, I exchanged private messages with them, explaining my plan for a synchronized mass sign-off, half amazed that I was putting so much faith in arcane scraps of lore gleaned from questionable sources, yet also bolstered by their earnest desperation, which mirrored my own. Together, we began a grassroots campaign on the forum to encourage watchers to sign up for a specific date and time, midnight in a universally agreed time zone, when we would all load the Purgatory Hall stream, assuming it was live at that moment, and then collectively leave or shut our devices after performing a quick, repeated mantra that I adapted from the shattering of the mirror text, simplified for ease of use. Skepticism abounded, and trolls pounced on the opportunity to ridicule the entire concept. Yet day by day, we gathered a small but growing cadre of supporters, many of whom had first-hand accounts of sleep paralysis, shadowy intruders, or unsettling anomalies linked to the hall, each one desperate for a fix that went beyond cheap thrill-seeking or half-baked advice to just unplug. As the designated date approached, Tension escalated throughout the forum. Sightings of the hall's feed supposedly spiked, with new ephemeral links surfacing and then vanishing in quick succession, often featuring nightmarish evolutions of the usual imagery. Some watchers reported seeing thick black vines creeping up the pillars. Others saw dangling shapes that resembled puppets hanging from the candelabras. Those screenshots remained elusive. My own nights were a maelstrom of nightmares that left me gasping awake, each dream more vivid than the last. Sometimes I was back in the corridor, each door replaced by one of those tall arches. Other times I was in an infinite mosaic of mirrors, each reflecting a piece of Purgatory Hall, as though it were fracturing reality itself, demanding more watchers, more eyes, more fear, while I scrambled to piece together the wards that might hold it at bay. Through it all, my friend, the occult researcher, stayed in contact via sporadic voice calls, offering what little reassurance they could, though I could hear the strain in their voice, as if even they sensed that this plan carried the risk of enraging the entity if it failed, potentially opening the floodgates to an even more entrenched presence. Finally, the fated night arrived, and I joined a private chat room with dozens of watchers who had promised to participate in the mass sign-off, each of us fully aware that we might be about to attempt something that ranged from fruitless to incredibly dangerous, depending on whether the entity perceived our efforts as a direct assault. At 1 minute to midnight, we confirmed that a new Purgatory Hall stream was indeed live. Someone had found an unlisted link circulating in a hush-hush Discord server, showing the familiar pillars, now draped in a sinister gloom, with flickering candlelight dancing across the floor and a single, hooded shape pacing near the archway, as if waiting for our arrival. Heart hammering, I synced my computer clock with universal time, feeling an electric tremor shoot down my spine as the seconds ticked closer to midnight, my gaze glued to the hooded figure in the feed, half expecting it to whip around and stare directly into the camera at any moment, but it simply paced, as though measuring the hall with patient strides. The chat among our group turned hushed and tense, all of us counting down the final seconds, and at precisely midnight I launched the stream, letting that dark hall fill my screen, the candle flames blazing bright with an unsettling eagerness, as if the entity recognized that a surge of watchers had just arrived all at once. A feast of attention lay before it. My chest tightened when the hooded figure paused, turning toward the camera at last to reveal a featureless face, a smooth expanse of pale flesh, with neither eyes nor mouth, reminding me of a doll or a mannequin. Yet the tilt of its head conveyed unmistakable awareness, as though it perceived the wave of new viewers with satisfaction. Swallowing hard, I typed a signal in the chat for everyone to begin reciting the simplified mantra we had agreed upon. This reflection is shattered. The mirror holds nothing, and though it felt silly to be chanting such words into the microphone, I closed my eyes and spoke them aloud, trusting in the collective force of dozens, maybe hundreds, who were simultaneously doing the same, each clinging to a shred of hope that this symbolic act could starve the hall of its lifeblood. The next 30 seconds were among the longest of my life. The feed flickered, the camera swerving wildly as if yanked by an unseen force, revealing glimpses of the arch, the pillars, and a swirling maelstrom of shadow that seeped from the floor, all accompanied by a low, resonant groan that rattled my speakers and reverberated in my sternum, as if the entity were raging at our defiance. Then came the final step. On my signal, we were to close the stream, shut down the computers or switch to a different channel, severing the connection en masse, thereby denying the hall the continued focus it needed to maintain its manifestation. And so, with trembling hands, I slammed my laptop lid shut, my heart in my throat, praying that everyone else did the same in near unison. For an instant, I felt the same sensation as when the corridor's feed had imploded, a psychic lurch, as though reality wavered around me, and a hot wave of nausea surged in my stomach, forcing me to sit down hard on the floor, breathing in short, ragged gasps as beads of sweat trickled down my brow, half expecting something vile to crawl out from beneath the laptop and seize me by the ankles. But nothing happened. There was no hiss of static, no flicker of candlelight dancing across my walls, only the quiet hum of my apartment appliances and my own heartbeat hammering in my ears, a dull ring echoing in my skull from the intensity of the moment. Slowly, painfully, I forced myself to stand, then mustered the courage to open the laptop once more, bracing for the worst, only to find that the feed link was dead, replaced by a connection error, and every alternative link I tried likewise timed out, as if the entire Purgatory Hall presence had winked out of existence at the stroke of midnight. My phone soon buzzed with messages from fellow participants, many breathless with relief or excitedly proclaiming that they felt a massive drop in tension the moment we all signed off, while a few reported splitting headaches or a wave of dizziness, but no sign of the feed reappearing, no new links posted, no hooded figure waiting in the gloom. Over the next few days, the forum that had been abuzz with discussion about Purgatory Hall fell oddly silent on the topic, with even the trolls and thrill-seekers moving on to other amusements, as though the hall had never been more than a passing curiosity, though a handful of us who orchestrated the sign-off shared cautious optimism that we had succeeded in forcibly shattering the mirror on a scale large enough to star the entity, preventing it from leaching further energy. For my part, I continued to experience residual nightmares, but they gradually lost their intensity, and although I still sometimes started at shadows or flinched when electronics glitched, I felt the oppressive pressure lift from my apartment, that nagging sense of being watched finally receding to a faint memory. Eventually, I visited my occult friend in person, carrying a printout of the simplified mantra we'd used, and together we analyzed the symbolism, concluding that by uniting many watchers in a simultaneous rejection of the hall's illusions, we had severed the collective belief that fueled it, mirroring the principle of, if no one looks in the mirror, the reflection cannot exist. And yet, I cannot claim with full certainty that the hall is gone forever, for the corridor once taught me how adaptable these phenomena can be, rising anew in different guises whenever curiosity and fear align to create the perfect breeding ground for them. And a small part of me remains vigilant, scanning the digital horizon for any sign the new endless live stream might be taking root, eager to lure fresh viewers into its labyrinth of dread. Once or twice, I did catch rumors about cryptic YouTube channels featuring slow pans of dark corridors or abandoned catacombs, but none possessed that same ominous vitality, that sense of a living presence behind the lens, so I have let them be, choosing instead to focus on rebuilding my life and letting the scars of those harrowing nights fade as best they can. The lessons, however, remain embedded in my thoughts. I have learned firsthand that the internet, with its sprawling networks and boundless anonymity, can serve as a powerful conduit for forces we scarcely understand, forging intangible constructs of fear and wonder that blur the line between fiction and reality, and that once we feed these constructs with collective fascination, they can become dangerously real, sapping the emotional energy of watchers and potentially transcending the screen to manifest in unsettling ways. If I have any lasting advice for those who might stumble onto the edges of these phenomena, it is simply this: be cautious where you place your focus, for in a realm where attention is currency, your curiosity can become the very fuel that nurtures something dark and predatory, and sometimes the bravest act is not to stare into the abyss, but to turn away and starve it of the sustenance it craves. In quieter moments, I catch myself wondering what might have happened if we had failed in that synchronized sign-off, if the hall had rallied its watchers' excitement into a critical mass, fully bridging the gap between its domain and ours. Perhaps we would have awakened one morning to find the architecture of our own world warped by pillars and candelabras, or discovered ancient runes burned into our walls, the apparatus's gears grinding on our desktops with unstoppable momentum. Fortunately, that reality never came to pass, and though I remain humble enough to consider the possibility that we simply delayed the inevitable, I also feel a quiet pride in having taken a stand, in resisting the seductive pull of the unknown at the moment it mattered most, and in urging others to do the same. Nowadays, I keep my digital habits relatively tame, avoiding random horror live streams and overhyped haunted channels, reminding myself that curiosity, while natural and often beneficial, can become lethal if we fail to recognize the hazards it invites from the dark corners of our collective psyche. Despite this caution, there is a lingering restlessness in my spirit, a slight unease every time I read about new viral sensations that revolve around creepy or unexplained footage, because a whisper in my mind always wonders, is this the corridor return, wearing a new skin? Is the hall rebuilding itself under a new brand, waiting to claim the next wave of watchers who cannot resist peering into the gloom? So I keep watch, albeit from a respectful distance, scanning the digital frontier for anomalies and quietly reaching out to those who show signs of stumbling upon something akin to that endless corridor or purgatory hall, reminding them that, sometimes, the safest path is to refrain from walking it at all, no matter how enticing the flickering lights might appear in the dark. As the months slip by, my nights grow mercifully less haunted, and I let myself believe that we truly did succeed in shattering the hall's reflection, at least for a time, perhaps giving the internet a chance to breathe without the weight of that monstrous presence skulking in the background. But I will never forget the terror of hearing that apparatus squeal through my headphones, nor the close brush of shadow I felt behind me as the hall tried to claw its way into my apartment, nor the satisfaction of slamming shut my laptop in unison with so many others, refusing to give fear the final word. If there is any flicker of hope to be gleaned from this twisted saga, it's the reminder that we can, at our finest hour, band together and deny the illusions that feed off our darkest impulses, that there is resilience and unity when a group decides collectively that they will no longer be pawns in a game of existential torment, though it requires both bravery and coordination in a medium as chaotic as the internet. At times, I find myself longing for a more mundane life, free of supernatural near-misses or arcane struggles, and yet I also realize that these encounters have awakened me to a larger tapestry of possibilities, both wondrous and terrifying, so I endure with watchful eyes, taking solace in the quiet normalcy of everyday interactions while bearing the knowledge that somewhere, in the uncharted depths of cyberspace, new nightmares can be born from the seeds of fascination and dread. In the end, even if Purgatory Hall is banished from my reality, I remain vigilant, for the internet's memory is vast and easily reawakened, and I know that all it might take is a single file, a single captured moment of that hooded figure or the swirling shadows, to reignite the viral cycle of watchers and reconstitute the entity anew. But at least now, there is a blueprint for resistance, a testament that we can fight back. For now, I content myself with the quiet triumph we achieved, grateful to have found a coalition of like-minded individuals willing to trust my warning and unify in the final gambit, aware that if not for their collective effort, I might have found myself trapped in a domain of living nightmares, forever feeding the gears of some unknowable horror. Sometimes I still hear that low hum in the middle of the night, a half-dream of mechanical churning, but when I flick on the light, there is no ominous feed on my screen, no candelabras or archways flickering into existence, just the comforting outline of my desk and a reflection of my own tired eyes, reminding me that even though I carry scars from two separate battles with the endless live stream's incarnations, I am still here, breathing, unclaimed by the darkness. Yes, I remain uneasy, haunted by the knowledge that we have only scratched the surface of how belief and technology intertwine, giving birth to phenomena that dance on the fringes of explanation. But I choose to see that knowledge as a shield rather than a curse, a reminder that vigilance and collective willpower can thwart even the most insidious attempts to enthrall us. And so, with this final testament, I draw my story to a close, acknowledging that, like the corridor before it, Purgatory Hall may live on in faint whispers of rumor or archived screenshots, lurking in the hush of abandoned message boards, but also taking heart in the notion that for now, however brief a reprieve it may be, our small alliance of watchers, turning away in unison, has exiled it from the mainstream consciousness, forcing it back into whatever cryptic domain it once crawled from. Should the endless live stream rear its head again, shifting once more into a new setting or storyline to ensnare unwary spectators, I will be ready, armed with the lessons of defiance gleaned from these trials, prepared to rally others and sever the reflection before it can grow too strong. Because if the corridor taught me anything, it's that refusing to look is sometimes the most powerful weapon we have, a means of starving the monsters that lurk in the digital shadows. And I hope that if anyone reading this hears rumors of a never-ending camera feed showing cryptic rooms and impossible architecture, you will weigh carefully whether a fleeting thrill is worth risking the slow seep of nightmares into your life, because once the entity senses your fascination, it can be maddeningly difficult to break free of its hooks or to close the door after you've already peered through its crack. In this swirling chaos of technology and imagination, where streams can morph into portals of self-fulfilling dread, my final plea is simple. Remember that the line between observer and participant can vanish with a single click, and sometimes your only safeguard is the choice not to watch at all, however strong the temptation might be. Because these endless live streams are more than mere videos, they're invitations, and the domains behind them are hungrier than you could ever imagine. Even as I write these words, I recall the flicker of that hooded figure turning toward the camera, the hush that fell when the candelabras flared, and the exhilaration of slamming my laptop shut in tandem with strangers across the globe, feeling a collective rush of defiance, as if we had for once in our scattered digital existence found unity and shared purpose, an uprising against the intangible predator that had sought to feast on our fear. So let this stand as a testament to the power of that unity, a spark of hope amid the gloom, and let it also be a warning that what we banish today may yet return tomorrow in a subtler, more seductive form, unless we remain steadfast in denying it the attention it craves, because at the end of all things, these phenomena live or die by our collective gaze, and turning away may be the bravest act of all. For now, I exhale a measured breath and close my eyes, seeking solace in the fact that, for the moment, no corridor or hall flickers on my screens, no static hum crowds my ears, and my reflection in the monitor remains my own, free of the twisted shapes that once haunted me. And though I cannot promise the beast is slain, at least it sleeps, and that is enough to grant me peace, as I return to the gentle monotony of life unclouded by the specter of the endless live stream, determined to cherish every silent, ordinary moment for as long as fate allows.